All right, thank you. So putting in kind of a perspective, the attacks on gender in our day, if gender is in fact tied to the image of God, as I believe it is, the attacks on gender and the confusion about gender is really, I think, one of the devil's most genius attacks. If fatherhood doesn't mean anything any different than motherhood, and being a son is the same as being a daughter or any variation of, if gender really has no meaning, then what does the fatherhood of God mean? What does the sonship of Christ mean? You can eliminate father and son if you can confuse the idea of gender. So I think it's a genius attack from the devil against the image of God itself. You know, there is something essential to fatherhood, something unique and different than motherhood. Exactly what that is, sometimes it's hard to put your finger on. But kids relate to dad differently than they do mom. Mom has different skills she brings to the table than what dad does. There's a difference, whether you can put your thumb on it or not. So to confuse that or attack that really is to attack God himself. And not surprising, those who are the most confused about gender very often are those the most confused about God. All right, what I want to do in the second half is it's kind of got the theme of there's nothing new. There's the feeling among people, I know my people, and I would guess you're here too, that this is something new and different and an attack against Christianity the church has never had to face before, and how are we going to deal with it? It's too much for us. I know there's sort of that opinion. What I hope to show you is there is nothing new under the sun. That the attacks, especially when we talk now about more sexuality, heterosexual, homosexual, bisexual, whatever sexual, there is nothing new under the sun. What we're seeing in our day is really what has been since the New Testament itself began. When I gave my lectures at Iowa State, one of the things the students had been taught that they brought against me was, you Christians are just traditionalists. You just want to hold us back with old traditions. That the world is progressive, we want to move forward, you keep holding us back. So Christianity is the enemy holding back progression. That's what I was told by them. So it got me thinking, is that in fact the truth? Is Christianity just an old bunch of traditions about sexuality that is kind of holding back society? What I discovered when I looked this up is, in fact, Christianity is not just a bunch of old traditions. Christianity is actually, and always has been, the radical point of view. That what is traditional in the world is what's being presented right now, sexuality-wise. That everything goes. So Christianity, and of course the main documents of Christianity, the New Testament itself, the apostolic ministry, the establishing of the church. So from the very beginning times, Christianity has faced this kind of thing. So just to walk you through this a little bit, what you have in front of you is Paul's missionary journey, all of them. And what you will notice, now, the Roman Empire during the first century, during the time of Paul, looked like that. That's the Roman Empire. So all of the areas where Paul did his missionary journey was in the Roman Empire. Now, the Roman Empire is a little like America in that it influences and affects the other cultures around us a lot. You know, other countries get Americanized. Part of the pushback of Russia is that there's just too much Americanization of the world. So there is this Americanization thing that does happen. There was this Romanization thing that happened as well. So people wanted to be like Rome. Roman culture infected these places. And that includes Roman views of sexuality. So all of Paul's ministry, all of the New Testament churches, all were established firmly in Roman territory under Romanist culture. That needs to be understood. Now, for the Romans, sexuality was not about orientation. This idea of being oriented a certain way is actually a relatively modern idea. In the Roman world, it had nothing to do with orientation. It had everything to do with do what you want to do, particularly for men. So you've got a quote from Plutarch in that time period from the establishment of the New Testament, that the noble lover of beauty engages in love wherever he sees excellence and splendid natural endowment without regard for any difference in physiological detail. Sexual attraction in the Roman world, and in the Greek world particularly before them, was about beauty. And the form they found the most beautiful were young boys. So attraction to young boys was a major part of Roman culture. Greeks particularly were worse than the Romans in that regard, with worshiping beauty essentially, particularly young male beauty. In fact, the Greek god of love is Eros, from where we get erotic, and it's always portrayed as a young boy. The Roman counterpart of that, the god of love, is Cupid, also portrayed as a young boy. So the very image in the Roman mind of sexuality is a young boy, the young male form. They did not consider this homosexuality. They considered it the pursuit of beauty. And in fact, the relationship of a man with a boy was seen as superior to the relationship between a man and a woman. And I'll explain that in a little bit. Now, whereas the Greeks were extremely concerned with beauty, particularly the young male form, one of the main social constructs in Rome, the main concerns, was rugged masculinity in a this kind of way, the male form, as a hard, dominant form. So to be a Roman male was to be dominant, to take what you wanted. You could, for instance, if you were a non-Roman, a Roman citizen could virtually do anything they wanted to you. A Roman citizen and a male, your life was about dominance. And they took great pride in dominating on the battlefield and sexually being dominant too. A Roman male would take whatever he wanted because he could. So you see a lot of images of warrior-type images in Roman art and in sculpture and things like that, all painting the Roman male as this very dominating figure. So a Roman male who owned slaves, and slavery was common throughout the Roman Empire. In fact, there were some cities where there were more slaves than there were free men. A Roman slave owner would be understood that he would use his slaves for his own sexual gratification, male or female alike, and it was completely within his right and expectation, in fact, in Roman society to do so. Even if he's married, that was not considered violating his marriage to his wife if he was exerting himself as a dominant male on the slaves. It was understood as well that he would be visiting prostitutes. In fact, prostitution made up a large part of the revenue of a lot of Roman cities. Prostitution was very common. Corinth is an example. There was a temple in Corinth to the goddess Diana that at one time in its history boasted over 1,000 prostitutes working at that temple. There are still existent songs that Roman soldiers used to sing as they sailed to Corinth about how they were sailing there to spend all the money that they had made as soldiers on the prostitutes. There are examples of winners at the Olympics who, in celebration of their victory, would donate 100 prostitutes to the temple. So Corinth was a center for prostitution. Not at all surprising that in 1 and 2 Corinthians, there are so many references to sexual sins that Paul had to address. It was their culture, and it was just pervaded everything in their culture. You may have seen recently, in fact, I think just last week I saw there was a new archaeological dig in Pompeii where they dug up some frescoes or cleared them out of rubble. Have you seen some of the art in Pompeii that they've uncovered? It's vile, utterly vile, very graphic sexually. Well, that was the Roman culture. They were extremely graphic, open sexually, anything went, male or female. It is exactly the kind of utopia, in fact, that the sexual champions of today want to create. So the sexual direction the world is taking is regressive, not progressive. We're becoming Rome again. Christianity is what freed the world from that. So domination. Now, if domination is kind of your main expression of maleness, not surprisingly, sexuality and your sexual practice was often brutal. And in fact, you yourself would be a brutal human being. And one sees this too, that with the increase of sexual freedom, if you want to call it that, also comes an increase of objectifying human beings and treating them cruelly. You hear this, frankly, in the news now every day with this arrest of P. Diddy. All the just horrendously debasing things, all in the name of sexual freedom. It all kind of goes together. So, particularly now with reference to the young boys. This is a term, malakos, used in Scripture. When I was giving this talk at the university, one of the students in the back had his Google open and found an article by somebody saying that this word malakos, which means soft, literally, is the word used in the New Testament for homosexual. Therefore, the New Testament really doesn't talk or say anything about homosexuality. It's talking about softness, which is, a social commentary about either rich people who are living soft lives or fat people who are just soft physically. So it's a commentary on being overweight or being rich. That's what the New Testament is talking about. That was his argument. And here's a clear case where context determines meaning. Can the word malakos mean soft? Yes, that is its primary meaning. But in Roman culture and in the New Testament, that word soft meant homosexual. It meant effeminate. It meant particularly the male who played the female in the sexual encounter. Now, a Roman male was hard, strong, tough. And that was okay. In fact, that was the Roman ideal. To be soft was against the Roman ideal. So even though homosexuality was common in the Roman Empire, in fact, pederasty particularly common, the idea of being the one on the receiving end of a homosexual relationship was still looked down upon. Julius Caesar is said to have come to power, I think it was Julius, come to power by giving himself to a neighboring king for money. And he was mocked in song in the Roman Empire for being soft, for playing the woman in order to gain power. But he was also well known to have been engaged in numerous other homosexual acts in which he was praised for his dominance. So it's the softness that was the problem in Rome, the playing the female role in the sexual relationship. It was not seen as homosexuality. It's just how you express yourself. So this is a word we do see in the New Testament, and this is the word the New Testament uses to describe homosexuality. It's playing the woman in a male relationship. Now, pederasty, we mentioned this already and how common this was. There are still available speeches you can find in writing by Roman senators praising their boys. They were very open about this, praising their relationship with boys. And the pederast relationship was seen as, in fact, superior to that of females, because in their mind, you were sharing yourself with an equal, whereas the Roman view of femaleness was abysmal. Women were a necessary evil in order to have children. But a woman in the Roman Empire could not vote. She could not participate in Senate. She could not go to any of these sporting games. She could travel with an escort into town. She was allowed to do a certain amount of business. Believe it or not, her status in the Roman Empire was better than women in the Greek Empire, who were virtual prisoners in their home. But the treatment of women in these cultures was horrendous. So when Christianity comes along, the early Christian converts were said to be 70% women. So the early church was by far and away more women than men, partly because Christianity comes along and gives value again to womanhood, speaks of it as carrying the image of God, talks about it as being loved by your husband, speaks of marriage as monogamy, all these things. So Christianity really saved womanhood from being abused by the Romans, who were just vicious. Here's an example of quoted from Lucian. Let women be ciphers and retained merely for childbearing, but in all else away with them, and may I be rid of them. For what man of sense could endure from dawn onwards women who beautify themselves with artificial devices, women whose true form is unshapely, but who have extraneous ornaments and beguile the unsightliness of nature? That's the Roman view of womanhood right there. So it was horrible. Christianity gives honor back to womanhood. And this is typical. This isn't just an off citation. So again, womanhood is belittled. Pederasty is good because it joins you with an equal. Pederasty was, there's the rest of that quote. I cut it off early. If at any rate one were to see women when they rise in the morning, last night's bed, you would think a woman uglier than those beasts whose name is inauspicious to mention early in the day. That's why they closet themselves carefully at home and let no man see them. Yeah, so how'd you like to be married to that guy? Pederasty went together with sports. The gymnasium. Anybody know what the Greek word gymnos, the word for gym, means? Naked. The word gymnos, the gym is naked. And in Rome, one of the ways they would train boys in pederast relationships is through the gymnasium, because all the exercise done in gymnasiums was done in the nude. And there are numerous accounts I came across in my reading of wrestling coaches being accused of inappropriate things during wrestling practice because everybody is wrestling nude. Of men coming to the gymnasium to find young boys to pair with for pederast relationships. They had sand on the floor of these gyms, and men would walk the gym floors looking for the imprints of the young boys in the sand. You know how perverse this is. But this is Roman culture. Girls were not permitted to exercise in the gymnasium, except in Sparta. Spartan women were allowed, but Greek and Roman women were not. It was also restricted what Romans could come to the gymnasium to look. You had to be a certain age. I think no one under the age of 25 could come and see the boys practicing in the nude. And you had to have a certain social status, no slaves or anything. You had to be a freeborn Roman with funds enough to support a pederast relationship. Because the pederast relationship was justified as training and support for young boys. That the men who often engaged in these relationships would ply them with gifts and would finance their education. So this was just considered part of the overall education of a young Roman boy, was to be in this relationship where he would gain gifts and monetary advancement and social advancement through these relationships. And this was everywhere. Pederast relationships invaded utterly throughout the Roman Empire. It's said that gymnasiums were in virtually every small and up town. Any town in our age that would be considered big enough for a hospital was big enough for a gymnasium. So these were everywhere throughout the Roman Empire. Now, just think about all this horrible perversity. And then take stock of the fact this is the era the New Testament was written in. These are the people the apostles are ministering to. These are the converts coming into the early Christian church. You can bet the early Christian churches were filled with people who had at one time been engaged in these sorts of relationships because it's what they were raised on as normal. So what the church had to deal with, and the conscience problems, the scarring left by these relationships socially, mentally, emotionally, the church had a lot of work to do in the New Testament times. So what we're up against in our day is not as bad as what this was. The world has been this way before, and the church flourished because it gave hope to these people who were trapped in this hopelessness. Now, back to kind of backtracking a little bit about the view of womanhood, and where did this come from, this negative view of womanhood and family, for that matter. The Greek myths actually promulgated this. The original woman in Greek mythology was Pandora. This is something actually pointed out to me by one of these students when I was lecturing, when I was talking about Adam and Eve and the importance of womanhood. She actually blamed Christianity for the negative views of womanhood. And she said Christianity is just like the Greeks. Man was made first and then the woman was made. And so women are less than men. That was her argument. But if you look at this, it's true that in Greek mythology the man is made first. But woman was made in the Greek mythology as punishment for men. Yeah, so men, plural, inhabited the world. Zeus's brother asked that they be given fire. Zeus refused. So the brother steals the fire and gives it to men. So in revenge, Zeus decided he was just going to destroy men because his brother liked them so much, and the way he was going to do it was by the creation of woman. So Pandora was made. Pandora literally means all gifts. Pan for all gifts. So the gods passed her around during her creation, and each of them gave her special gifts. They gave her the gift of beauty, the gift of enchantment, alluring, these sorts of gifts, so that men would find her utterly unattractive, or utterly what's the word I'm looking for? That's the word I'm looking for. Utterly irresistible. Yes. And then she was brought to earth, and a man naturally, immediately sees her, falls in love with her. And then the story is, this man was given a container, a jar by the gods. filled with troubles and some good things, but mostly it seems troubles. And he was never supposed to open the lid of this, or those troubles would be unleashed on mankind. So he tells Pandora, look, don't open that. He leaves the house and immediately she opens it. All the troubles of mankind escape. So the reason why mankind suffers now, it's all a woman's fault. And the only thing that remains is hope, because as hope was getting out of the jar, it got stuck on the lid, and then she closed it. So mankind still has hope for something, but it's an unrealized hope. So the original poem, original citation, the first written one of Pandora, is from Hesiod, 8th century BC, and this is what he says. From her is the race of women and female kind. Of her is the deadly race and tribe of women who live amongst mortal men to their great trouble. No helpmates in hateful poverty, but only in wealth. Even so, Zeus, who thunders on high, made women to be an evil to mortal men with a nature to do evil. So, all the way back in Greek mythology, this is how it was understood women were. And this divide between women and men. Now, as we talked about in the first session, the image of God placed into women and men was one of perfect unity, wholeness, love. You know, how far humanity had fallen to put a divide like this between men and women. But Christianity comes along and restores it. Restores it through the gospel. All right. As an example of how truly radical Christian views were, and radical in the sexuality terms, as we mentioned, the monogamy, the love being associated, the joining sex to marriage, again, unheard of in the Roman world. Besides that, it's this. Let the husband render to his wife the affection due her, likewise also the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband doesn't have authority over his own body, but the wife does. That would have been absolutely turning the Roman social order upside down. They would have agreed with the first part of that in the middle. The wife does not have authority over her own body. That's right, the husband does. But the last bit, unheard of in that culture. This isn't tradition. Remember the accusation that they brought against Christianity is just traditions. That's not a tradition. There is no tradition that had this prior to this, other than the proclamation of God's word. The Jews didn't have that either at the time, rabbinical Judaism. In rabbinical Judaism, polygamy was a given and understood that men could have multiple wives, no question. The idea of love joined to marriage in Judaism was non-existent. There's a great, I don't want to sidetrack too much, there's a great line, Fiddler on the Roof. You know the movie? The husband talking to his wife, and it was an arranged marriage. And she asks him, do you love me? And it catches him so off guard. You know, it was an arranged marriage. They were arranged. He goes through the whole process in this song, and at the end of it he says, I guess I do. But love, which is almost kind of an afterthought in Jewish marriage, was the original design. So this is not a traditional thing that Paul says. And this, again, elevates, in the sexual relation, elevates women to exactly the same level as the men, that they both have authority over each other's body. Romans accused Christians of being haters of humanity, of turning the world upside down. This is part of the reason why they saw it as turning the world upside down, because Christianity was giving dignity back to womanhood that Roman secular culture had taken away from her. Now, as an example of how these things often work, and I'm not sure what this says of our country, the leaders a country chooses very often reflect the culture and set the tone to culture. They serve a dual purpose. So a leader of a country can get a public opinion going in a certain way or a public spirit going in a certain way, but at the same time, they completely reflect the public spirit at the time. So, put that into the current election however you want to, but it is a commentary on how the country thinks and where the country is going. The same is true in Rome. And if you look at the Roman leaders in particular, they were horrendous human beings. There's a book by Suetonius called Lives of the 12 Caesars. And he traces the 12 Caesars from Augustus onward, the first Caesars. And these are the Caesars in power when the New Testament is written, when Jesus walked the earth. This was Roman culture during that era. Augustus, the first of them that he portrays, he's often held up as the most fair-minded of all of the Caesars. His rule lasted 40 years. Yet it was well known, publicly known, that he had numerous male lovers. There are stories of Augustus going to dinner and then taking the wife of another senator from the table to his bedroom and having his way with her, and then coming back, sitting down and finishing his dinner. Suetonius tells how in later years, Augustus' wife would actually help round up the most beautiful young girls she could find from the Roman Empire and bring them to Augustus to, as Suetonius put it, to deflower. So he was a sexual predator, bisexual. In fact, homosexuality is almost non-existent in the Roman Empire. It's bisexuality. They weren't oriented, they just were dominant. So they took whatever they wanted, both sexes. There wasn't such a thing as homosexuality, so to speak. So rampant public, horrible human being when it comes to his sexual practices. That was the first and considered to be the most level-headed of the Caesars. Tiberius follows him. Tiberius is known to have assaulted babies sexually, actually. Suetonius writes about this. He had a pool where he hired young boys to swim with him. And again, forgive this, Suetonius' description, and nibble on his private parts as he swam. It's just utterly perverse. He sometimes would murder the people he assaulted sexually, especially the children, so that word of what he had done wouldn't get out. So he's a rapist, he's a pedophile, bisexual adulterer. And this was known publicly, so much known, in fact, that a neighboring king actually wrote him a letter suggesting to him that he should commit suicide because he was so hated by his own countrymen for being such a pervert. That's the Roman emperor in power when Jesus is crucified. That's the guy the Jews yell, "We have no king but Caesar." They would rather have that than Christ. Can you imagine? That's where the world was at when Christianity was born. And if you thought Tiberius was bad, no, this is his retreat, first of all. It's called Capri. And where it is, on Capri, he hired girls and boys to dress up like nymphs and fairies and go hide in the woods where people would go seek them out to rape them, essentially. He would take the young boys and girls sometimes, if he was particularly brutal and didn't want word getting out, and walk them over to the edge of the cliff there and just push them off into the ocean. That's how he was known to have killed them. He kind of isolates himself through a lot of his reign on Capri, which was his sexual playground, just to get away from the people. Yeah, so right, this is what the Jews imagine that. This guy follows, and I'm sure you've heard his name, Caligula. If you were to take a guy who was a serial killer and a sexual predator, the worst of which, like a Jeffrey Dahmer kind of guy, you've got Caligula. And then give him absolute power. Caligula was truly a psychopathic murderer. He had a god complex, too. He ordered all of the statues in Rome of the gods to have their heads removed and his head put on their place. He had a special temple to himself actually erected in Rome, where there was a gold figure of him in this temple. He had his own priesthood that served his idol. He would have his idol dressed according to whatever he was wearing on the day. So the Caesars thought of themselves as gods. In fact, society thought of them as gods. They were living gods. And Caligula rode that as far as he could go. So as a god, of course, a god can do whatever a god wants to do. So they got away with all of this because, well, they were God. Caligula commanded the murder of his brother. He forced his father-in-law to commit suicide. He lived incestuously with his sisters. He, too, would take female dinner guests like Augustus did, take them into the room, rape them, bring them back, sit at the table, and then talk about their prowess in the bedroom with their husbands over supper. He was known to have many homosexual, or I should say male, lovers in homosexual relations. He enjoyed cross-dressing, so the drag queen thing, the cross-dressing, it's Roman. It's nothing new. It's always been there. On occasion, he brought in a soldier for a dinner in order to entertain his guests, and the soldier was the one most skilled in beheading. And so the dinner guests got to watch a string of prisoners come in, and this soldier would behead them in front of them for dinner entertainment. Now, we mentioned before that when sexual promiscuity runs wild, brutality seems to run with it. There is an objectification of human beings involved. Our world is becoming more brutal, and it's being coupled with becoming more sexually engaged and open to these sorts of things. So we are regressing. It is not Christianity that's holding back progress. It's society that wants to regress, and Christianity is trying to hold it back from regressing. Now, one of Caligula's more famous things is Cassius Dio, one of the source books for this, records that there was an incident at the arena once when there weren't enough criminals to feed to the wild beasts, so Caligula had some of the spectators who were watching on the side, first of all, cut their tongues out so they couldn't protest, and then threw them to the beasts so he could watch that. So you didn't necessarily want to go to the arena and watch the fun when Caligula was there watching. So after Caligula, Caligula was eventually killed by his own guard. Claudius, who is said to be the only one of the first 12 Caesars from Augustus who did not enjoy intercourse with other males. But he too was truly a sexual deviant, to whom Paul appeals when he's arrested. He appeals to go to Rome. Nero is the one who ultimately kills Paul and Peter. So two of the apostles are killed under Nero's reign. He singled out Christians for special tortures. He hated Christians with a passion, probably because he knew what Christian views on sexuality were, and he was among the most perverse. He was engaged in an incestuous relationship with his mother, eventually has her killed. His sister, he also, believe it or not, was married in a public ceremony to another guy. Same-sex marriage is not new. In fact, he was married twice. Here is Cassius Dio account of Nero's marriage. Nero called Sporus. It was a slave that he had married, that he gave free status to, and castrated to arrest further male development, but named it Sporus or Sabina. Sabina, I think, had been a wife, maybe even a sister that he had one time loved who died. Now, Nero called Sporus Sabina not merely because, owing to his resemblance to her, he had been made a eunuch, but because the boy, like the mistress, had been solemnly married to him in Greece. Tigellinus, a friend giving the bride away as the law ordained. All the Greeks held a celebration in honor of their marriage, uttering all the customary good wishes, even to the extent of praying that legitimate children might be born to them. After Nero had two bedfellows at once, Pythagoras, who played the role of husband to him, and Sporus, that of wife. Nero was very big into cross-dressing. You know, all of the sexual things we see in our day, they're all there in Rome. There's nothing new. But look what Christianity did. The constant proclamation of Christ, the forgiveness of sins. That's a lot of sins to forgive if somebody was wrapped up in that. A lot of conscience problems. The mercy of Christ. The ministering to people who had been hurt by this, who had been raped. A big part of the early church's ministry was trying to apply Christ and mercy and forgiveness into people coming from a culture where they had been brutalized. So this is what we have to offer. We say there's nothing new under the sun. We have that same message. We're not out of our league because things are so bad. We have Christ. We have forgiveness. We can direct people to a God who knows them intimately, loves them, has mercy on them, and can call them away from this sexual trap that they are in. So don't feel like you're out of your league because things are so bad out there. It's been worse. And God brought Christ into the middle of it and saved these people who were caught up in that, and will do the same through us. So that's my time. Thanks. Yeah, of course. Mm-hmm.
Hey, would you join me in thanking Pastor Rueger one more time? Thank you very much. It is worth saying this is also, I got to do a lot of the coordinating for this. I want to thank